Welcome to this exciting webinar, Adult Online Learners, Key Findings on Recruitment and Retention. I'm Luke Schultheis, an enrollment manager by career, and I'm joined today by JT Allen, the founder and CEO of myFootpath, which has funded the study, and by Don Hossler, the lead researcher, Sonborn Provost Professor Emeritus of Education Leadership and Policy at Indiana University, and it's Bloomington's highest award for research and teaching. If you've studied enrollment management at all, you've certainly got some of Dr. Hossler's books on your shelf and cited him in your dissertations. So we're thrilled to be amongst an amazingly accomplished scholar. What we're going to do today is really take you through the structure, the warrant for the study, the methodology for the study, and some initial findings on this study. If we go to the next page here, I'll outline these 3 points on the next one. There we go. Really, this study comes at the intersection of these three items. There is, a significant need for us to look at online enrollments and how persistence plays a role into success for the students, as well as net tuition revenue contributions to the institution and degree completion. We've got an enrollment cliff that's here. We've also got a significant sort of questioning of the value of higher education today. And we've got some aside from recent federal policy changes about student loan debt and default, all sorts of other stuff that's now being discussed. And it really does create an urgent need for us to look at this population. So I'm going to take us into this next slide, which is a map of adults who have stopped out or applied, been admitted, and never started, and move it over to JT Allen to discuss, why did you commission this study? Why did you find it a worthwhile endeavor and bring in, such a powerhouse as Dr. Hossler?
For sure. Well, a couple of things. So one is good to be with everybody. My name is JT Allen. I'm the CEO of myFootpath. We are a business that is dedicated to bringing back stop outs. And so this market is what we spend, most of our time in every day, right? And so when I look at this market, these stop outs and the folks who, the nuns are those who applied but never actually got started in classes. These are the adult students, right? And so what we see is that most of these students will come back online, and they do that for a variety of reasons, but there is a lot of, it has to do a lot with flexibility and kind of where they are in their career. They don't live near their campus where they started, right, anymore. So that happens. And so as we look at this market and talk with different institutions about, bringing back these folks, it often finds its way into the online world. And so we commissioned this study for a couple of reasons. So one is that, because we're talking about it every day, we hear a lot of the challenges that our clients are having. And so we want to just contribute to the best practices, right? To be a part of the community and to help folks understand, hey, what's going on? What are others doing? How can we benchmark ourselves? And then the other reason is really that in organizing around online students and in organizing around re-engagement, we suspected that there might be some parallels. Re-engagement in particular, it's not owned by anybody in an institution. So you've got silos, you've got different people, different opinions, how you go at it, etc. And what we found through this work was, a lot of that was similar in the online world, right? How to kind of get the organizer around it. So part of our work with clients is to help that organization. And so we hope this study also helps folks organize around that online experience, as they work to recruit students and really to help them succeed.
Fantastic. It's a real contribution. It's the foundation, I think we could say fairly, to a field that hasn't had a tremendous amount of rigorous research applied to it to date. So thank you for commissioning the study and having us apply rigor to it. Let's go to the next slide, and I'll turn it over to Don here. Don, there's in my inbox, there's no shortage of surveys from vendors coming in the door, and little notes on, well, we interviewed so and so, and here are the findings. You apply a level of rigor to studies. Can you take us through a little bit of how you constructed the means by which you conducted this, some of the methodology, why you chose certain institutions, and why we went with a grounded theory approach instead of other approaches?
Sure, be happy to. And I would just start by noting that we already know that online students are more likely to drop out than, let me just call them, bricks and mortar students. So there's already a kind of a flag out there. We need to pay attention to this. And so I'm on the advisory board for myFootpath, and JT and I were talking one day, and we got talking about, gee, we really don't know much of anything about exactly what institutions are doing to try to enhance student persistence. And it was out of that kind of just casual conversation that a few months later led to the undertaking of this study. Because we know so little about what institutions are doing, it's not really possible to craft a survey, because if you're going to craft a survey, you already know a lot of the major underlying principles driving and involving a set of phenomena. And we don't have this. So the appropriate way to go is what is called an exploratory qualitative study. You do a qualitative because you're looking for your interviewees to provide you with that perspective so that you can begin to clarify things and then follow up with a survey. And we were most interested not in, I mean no disrespect, the behemoths are doing, not what Southern New Hampshire University is doing, not what Purdue Global is doing, but what are the most of the institutions out there that have some presence online, but that isn't their bread and butter. So we took institutions that we knew had high persistence rates at the undergraduate level, not broken out by residential, if you will, bricks and mortar versus online, because that's hard to get at. But we at least use that as a threshold. And we only looked at institutions for which 30% or fewer of their total enrollment was online students. I sent an invitation out to over 100 public and private institutions. After 2 weeks, institutions we hadn't heard back from at all, I set up a follow-up email that eventually got us to 31 institutions that were interested in participating in the study. But things happen. Of those 31, a few never got around to actually agreeing to set up that interview itself. So out of that 31, we ended up with 26. Of those 26 institutions, 2 actually didn't have as many online programs as IPED had indicated. So we threw them out. So we end up with a usable group of 24. That's still, in this day and age, for survey research, if you get 24%, you're doing really well. So that becomes the group from which we conducted interviews, usually 60 minutes. A few ran as long as 120, 130 minutes. I don't think any lasted fewer than 50, 55 minutes.
And I think what was interesting also is, if we were interviewing presidents, there's one president, there's one provost. For this particular set of research, I believe there were a variety of different institutional stakeholders with whom you led discussions. Could you just touch on that a little bit?
Well, We started by, we just asked them an open-ended question: to whom do you report? The largest percentage of respondents, but they were still far less than half, indicated they reported to the provost. Actually, it was more than half. Some reported to the enrollment manager. That was the next largest group of officers to whom they reported. Two, interestingly enough, reported to the chief information officer. So there was the provost was the most prevalent, but it was by no means the only. And in addition to that, some of them had titles like associate vice provost or vice provost, but some of them were directors of online learning. There were several who reported someone who reported to the provost.
I love it. And I think this gets to some of the findings and how we find things have been different among many institutions, but there were three findings that stood out. We'll look at the first one now, which had to do with planning. So I know some of the questions had to do with, who sets the goals? What are the goals? What different populations? So traditionally, institutions are, establishing and publicizing goals for new incoming first-time full-time students, new transfers, and we'll also see, although to a lesser degree, unfortunately, numbers of students who are continuing on through their career. But can you share with us, please, Don, a little bit of the findings on who's set up goals, how those played into structure, and what that all looked like?
Well, I really view this line of research. Jerry Lucido and I, that's hard for me to believe, about 16 or 17 years ago, I actually did a set of studies very similar to this, where we were looking at how institutions and their bricks and mortar students, how did they organize themselves for recruitment and retention? And this heading is a little misleading because there weren't all that many institutions that were doing these things in a way that we actually think it takes to be successful. Much like Jerry and I concluded from that early line of research, if you are not systematically tracking the students and whether they are persisting or not, you're probably not likely to be doing much to try to help them succeed. Because if you don't know whether they're succeeding or not, there's no big press to say, gee, we need to do something about this. So as you can see, only 16% of the people interviewed said they could easily pull up a report, that a report was routinely generated that tracked the persistence of online students. 54% said they couldn't get reports at all, even if they wanted to. In between were those who said they knew their institutional databases enough that they could go in and extract those reports. So it's not a very encouraging picture initially of what these institutions are doing, because if you're not tracking the success of your online students, you're not going to build any support to launch important initiatives to help them be successful. As the slide shows, only 34% even included online students when they created their enrollment goals for the next year. So it kind of signals for a lot of these institutions, in a very real sense, in terms of the senior policy making tables of these institutions, online students are an afterthought.
While maybe a subtopic, could you speak a little bit about what you heard in regard to institutions establishing specific academic programs for online study?
We did hit, I mean, this was, I thought, a healthy sign that most of the institutions we interviewed were looking at labor market needs in establishing their online programs, or they were looking at their own their own data, so to speak, and what are the programs for which we have high demand, for whom, because of limitations of space, et cetera, we might not be able to admit because we simply don't have the physical space to admit them. So institutions generally were being pretty thoughtful about the programs they were creating. But again, since so few institutions had an organized structure, it was happening more, I want to say in a more happenstance way, that individual programs were making a case, or someone who was the director of online learning, who again might have been 2 or 3 layers removed from the provost, was looking at this and encouraging programs to move online.
Did you find that control or allocation of budgets played any kind of role into, let's call it sort of the power behind developing programs and enrollments for online study?
And Luke's very generous to say you. It should have said under the methodology. Either Luke or JT were on every phone call, and in keeping with good qualitative research, we met 3 or 4 times during this study to basically say, okay, we're both separately taking notes, but are we hearing the same things? And by the way, occasionally we added an extra question because something emerged that wasn't in our interview protocol that we thought, boy, this is really important. Even though we can't ask everybody, we're going to do this for the rest of the interviews. And Luke, remind me of your question. I got sidetracked there.
Oh, sure. Appreciate the acknowledgement. It's generous of you. The role of budgets and incentives maybe, and how those may have or may not have impacted expansion of academic program development.
Yes. And let me preface it by saying, if I was going to be involved in a follow-up study on this, this is an area I would want to pursue, because we can't really prove that there's a causal relationship between these two things. But at every institution for which there was a larger and better resourced unit dealing with online education, the units that had access to reports, the units that had more of a structure, there was really 3 different kind of things we heard. Some of them said they were on a responsibility center budget model. And for those of you who don't live in the budgeting world, that means that basically every academic unit is responsible for its own costs, but also the institution has created some kind of algorithm where they get a substantial part of the revenue they generate back for them to spend. So that was one example. In one case, intriguingly, in fact, I wanted to go back and look up because I was a little surprised they could do this. I don't know. I also dabbled in higher ed finance, and I don't know, and I don't recall enough about the budgeting structure of universities to know if this is exactly kosher, but in one case, they were an auxiliary enterprise. Auxiliary enterprises have a lot more freedom in terms of what they do with their income. And in one case, it's kind of a responsibility center budget model. One enrollment manager to whom online reported said, well, we get X% of tuition revenue of every student that enrolls, and we can pretty much do with what we want. Those were the institutions that had larger, more centralized, more robust enrollment management structures.
That's fantastic. JT, can you talk a little bit about, please, in your experience working with institutions, kind of echoing what Don's brought up about the general lack of access to good data and what you've seen when you reach out to institutions to receive data?
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, and just to echo kind of Don's comments, because it plays very much to your question, Luke, is you know, the budgeting dollars definitely drove let's call it sophistication of reporting. And what we would find is that, I mean, every person we interviewed, I felt like kind of had to do their own homegrown version of it if they couldn't get at it institutionally, right? So, meaning they were digging through data and trying to figure out what they could get at so that they, and then many had like, you know, the planning process in place to like get the numbers, right? But I mentioned that because it's kind of similar with reengagement, right? Like reengagement doesn't even get the attention of online, right? So it's, you know, you have online and then you have reengagement, right? And so the way that you get at the numbers and the data there, if you don't do it all the time, it can just be unfamiliar. And so particularly with our clients, what we see, I mean, all the time is that even as we talk about the different populations where the students may come from to re-engage, there's often just, you know, incorrect data, there's misinformation, there's just kind of a lack of clarity on it. So a lot of our work is to help institutions kind of figure that out, you know, from a data analytics perspective, and it kind of tracks similarly to, you know, some of the work that's kind of underway in the online.
Great, thanks for sharing that. On our next slide, we're going to examine here a little bit about service differentials. Now, I recently had a conversation with a very well-known, very large institution that was proud to share with me they've just opened up a one-stop. And I was polite and said, that's great. There are institutions now that have bots and direct messaging and figure they're ahead of the curve. But Don, in meeting with some of these institutions, I think there was a discovery that we had about a different level of concierge service for these students, both for onboarding and throughout the life cycle. And I want to jump ahead a little bit to discuss something you had mentioned earlier, which was why we did this exploratory study, and it was because we didn't know what would come out. So the original aspect of it had to do with retaining students, but then another theme emerged that had to do with recruitment as well. So how can you share with us, please, some of the concierge style services and how those played a role in catering to this population?
Right. If you could get slides or articles or white papers to talk, I would describe it this way. We were studying retention, and then we discovered we were discovering recruitment too. I say that because, again, the universities that had more robust staffs had these concierge kind of models, and that is a term you'll find in the literature about online. So we're not, unlike our president, we're not inventing that term. It's already out there as it relates, excuse me for my politics in there. It's already out there in reference to the way some institutions serve their online students. So what we found for the institutions that have robust staffs was that they had often what they didn't, as individuals, they referred to them as usually as coaches or advisors. And those advisors were assigned students from the point of inquiry. And so part of their job was to help move those inquiries to applications to recruitment. But once those students matriculated, those advisors stayed with students and they helped with onboarding. And by the way, the research suggests that onboarding for online students is just as important as it is for bricks and mortar students. A good, what we think of as orientation, but we now call more frequently onboarding, is really important. Those students helped with that. Those students helped them register. Actually, not those students, those coaches, those advisors helped them register. Those advisors stayed, if the students had questions about a class or needed assistance, They either were able to provide that directly or to put them in touch with staff on the campus or the individual professors to help them. And so they really were a kind of a cradle to grave operation. They started at the point of inquiry, and so it really was. We discovered in some ways we were studying recruitment while we were studying retention. And they also had, a lot of them had mini registrar's offices, meaning that they could do quick transfer analyses. The two things that emerged that, again, we didn't start out looking for. That rapid transfer evaluation, and as well as processes that granted credit for life experiences, and institutions that had some macro undergraduate and graduate majors rather than specific, so that students had the opportunity to transfer credits in. And so how does that all fit in with retention? Well, no surprise, the more credit hours students can bring in, and this is an empirical statement, this is not our research, somebody's already found this. The more credit students can bring in, the more likely they are to graduate. The sooner students find out how many credits are going to count, the more likely they are to enroll in that institution. So these institutions had mini registrar's units that could do the transfer credit evaluation. Not all of them, but many of them had administered credit for life experience. They had people within their staff that could do that. They had people within their staffs who could do that related to veterans. And all those things were important in both recruiting students, but I really want to underscore this over and over and over again. The more credit hours students can bring in, the more likely they are to graduate. It makes sense. The light at the end of the tunnel is much less dim. I can see how I can get this done.
That's really enlightening. Thanks for sharing it. JT, you've certainly come across institutions in which the re-enrollment process, be it readmission or re-registering, sort of starts and ends with someone in the registrar's office, asking you to complete a form and then, sending off a checklist of 25 other things. Can you speak a little bit about the value that you've seen in this finding that's come up as being critical in supporting adults, the concierge level handoffs?
Yeah, and I mean they're particularly acute in readmission, right? So what we see is, I mean, every student, right, kind of new or returning, typically wants to answer two questions: how long is this going to take, and what's it going to cost? And so the way you get at that, right, is by understanding kind of what you've got, your availability for the credits, and what's going to transfer in if you've got them in other places, and if not, what's your degree, what's that path, what's the clarity on the path to graduation. So a lot of our work is really focused on that, right? How do you see the path to graduation? And it sounded like, what we saw, I mean, in the institutions we identified, I mean, granted, they started with a very high retention rate, so people were successfully getting through this at a decent pace, right? I think where we found kind of the success amongst the online groups is when they could kind of control the different activities Don described kind of in their shop. And so what we find in a lot of our work with reengagement, if it's in the particular silo, it goes pretty fast. It's when it goes outside of the silo and into a different department, that's where it gets kind of bogged down. And so and it was similar here, right? We saw that with the online leaders who were really finding success, it was because they could drive the process one way or another, and they sort of figured out how to do that.
Thanks. Don, when the questions were being asked of different institutions and the availability of services sort of around the clock, if you will, outside of the 9 to 5, what were some of the other areas that were being inquired about? Some of the other administrative offices.
Well, we asked about virtually every office that is part of most enrollment management organizations. That, you know, we asked about the registrar's office, we asked about the bursar's office, we asked about academic advising, we asked about academic support, meaning if students are having trouble with classes, how could they get it? We asked about the availability of IT support if people are having trouble getting into a class. And that was a more of a ray of light, I would say. I would give most of the respondents somewhere between I'd probably give most of them between a C plus and a B minus, where it would have been lower in all these other areas. Most of them were doing pretty well in the area of advising. Most of them were doing pretty well in lieu of academic support. But again, now some of it, interestingly enough, a few schools for that academic support were outsourcing that. It was a form of outsourcing I was unfamiliar with, but a few schools actually were contracting with organizations that would provide that support in off hours. But again, with the concierge model, what was happening at some places as those coaches, advisors were helping make appointments. In some schools, they had staff, academic support staff that were available off hours to make appointments with. And also another area where outsourcing, a fair number of schools outsourced their off-hour support for IT needs to vendors outside.
Right. Can you speak a little bit, Don, about the importance you may have found in regard to not just a degree audit type activity, but academic planning for students?
Yeah, we were asking questions about the extent to which students could look ahead to see what courses were going to be offered so they could make their plans. About 60% of the schools, they could look out one semester. If you started to ask 2 semesters or 3 semesters, those numbers went down. And I'm going to add a threshold that no one met. As part of a Lumina grant, some colleagues, Vasti Torres and I had at IU, this is a couple decades ago now, but we were looking at working students attending community colleges in Northwest Indiana. One of the things that not all, but a couple of campuses had added was not only could students look 2 or 3 semesters out as to what would be offered, they could look 2 or 3 semesters out as to exactly when those courses were going to be offered. And that was really a critical thing for the students, because we also interviewed students because they knew they could talk to their bosses. And so if they were not in professional jobs, if they were in hourly jobs, they could work their schedule. They could start talking to their boss 6 months out. Gee, I can't work Tuesday nights. So that was for those students, a really critical thing in their ability. And I guess that's something I'd personally recommend for institutions that are really serious about this. First, it has to be more than 1 semester out, so people can see that light at the end of the tunnel. They can see, oh yeah, I'll be able to take 2 classes next fall, and there will be 2 classes available in the summer, but an even higher level. And this is when they're going to be offered. And not default to, well, the faculty members, we can't predict what they're going to do, which happens at research universities like mine. We can't even be sure if those courses are going to be offered next semester.
Right.
I would echo too as well that you know, as folks are listening to this, is some of it can be, I mean, you know, online takes away the time factor many times. It's asynchronous, right? But what you don't really know is, I mean, many of the folks would say, oh, well, we got degree works, they can look at the plan. Well, yeah, of course they can look at the plan. But what then is that how does those courses sequence out to get through the plan? So that was the missing step. And so even if you bulk or focus on some of the core ones where a lot of people are getting stuck in some pretty easy analysis, you could probably unstick them, if you will, to help them get through a little bit better.
Great advice.
Great point.
Moving into our third key finding, student financing. The respondents came from literally all over the nation, and we know today's environment, there are different structures in place, some state regulations, some institutional constraints that all affect the way an institution can, we'll call it, deal with a student and their need to take care of prior balances or be able to manage financing their education. Don, could you talk a little bit about some of the different options that you've found out, through the study?
Yes, and I'll just preface it by saying a substantial percentage of all stop-outs have unpaid bursar bills. That's just a fact. So I was kind of curious to start with, if anybody, having been the vice chancellor for enrollment at Indiana University for 8 years, I was curious if any institutions were using tuition discounting strategies with online students, and the absolute answer is absolutely not. But they were using financial aid in some ways. There were some schools that had scholarships specifically for veterans. There were some schools that had scholarships for students who enrolled in the second consecutive semester, creating an incentive to keep enrolling. There was a school that had, when students first enrolled with them as stop-outs, not necessarily their students, they would get a voucher for textbooks and a $500 credit towards their tuition bill. There was a school that any students who transferred from community colleges, that their tuition rate was set at the same rate as the community colleges in that state. There was one school that was for students who were re-enrolling at their institution who had unpaid bursar bills, that they were forgiving a percentage of their bursar bill for every semester in which they re-enrolled. So there were strategies like that employed to using some types of financial aid or financial incentives to help students out, but also to incentivize the students to continue to enroll.
It's really interesting today. I think I read, I can't point to the specific report, but I believe I saw the other day an indication that discount rates are on the rise again. So we're in this arms race of competing for a finite and decreasing population, arguably, while we've got 43 million adults out there who have started and not continued. And we're doing very little institutionally and certainly systematically to provide some sort of funding outlet for this population. JT, assuming you've seen also, when you interact with institutions, some sort of guardrails that may be established with the premonition of, well, we've got these kind of regs, and how do you discuss creativity with institutions?
Sure. Well, in a lot of our work, what we're trying to do is, one is to get re-engagement, right? To get the list, if you will, as large as possible. And then focusing in on what are the different populations' needs. So, so easy for institutions is to first go after the students who don't have any bursar bills, right? Because that's, we call them free and clear, right? They can come back through a different path. But then when they do, it's sort of figuring out, well, okay, what do you want to do, right? How important is it to the institution? What does the financial model look like? If is a semester worth a $500 discount? Is it worth a $200 discount? How do you weigh that against each other? So it's really figuring out, what are just various pathways that a student may return through. And then, and then in our work, the next step is then how do you tailor the communication to make, to kind of shout it from the mountains it's to hear that, so because it takes a while to set in that, oh, it may be different than what I see on the website.
Right. Our next slide, and we're coming to a close very shortly, is on emergent themes. And Don, I'll just pick two here. Maybe you could provide some brief observations on it, and how maybe institutions that are succeeding with adults in online education do things differently than the sort of the formatting for the traditional student. Let's look at flexible start dates and web pages, for example. What were some themes that you heard, either good or bad, from institutions in this regard?
Well, they were in the minority, but a number of institutions did have flexible start dates. One had 8 different start dates. And again, you think about working students and the time constraints they face. Often, once they're ready to go, they are ready to go. And the last thing you want to do is say, well, gee, it's late September and we don't have another semester starting until January. One school had start dates didn't matter. All of their courses were entirely asynchronous. But I do think flexible start dates are an interesting and potentially positive way to influence. Web pages, this only started to come up towards the end. So this is kind of, when I say emergent themes, it's really emergent. But a couple schools mentioned, and then they asked maybe just 2 more about this, and it was a recurring theme for just right towards the end, that there's always a battle on campuses for web pages. Who's going to be the front page? Who's going to be easily accessible? Is it going to be undergraduate admissions? Is it going to be development? Is it going to be alumni affairs? Well, if students can't find you on web pages, guess what? They're unlikely to enroll. And if they can't get information easily about once they've applied. So I think web pages is another one I think would be interesting. That would be relatively easy. Just look at a lot of web pages and see what they're doing or not doing. I do want to put a plug in for Readiness for Adult Learners, because it was only one school, but this really intrigued me. I won't name the state, but they identified a metropolitan area where there were a large number of students with some college, but they were over 40. And so they were making the assumption they might not be up to speed on using computers as much as those under 40. And so they were actually sponsoring workshops, real live, go someplace, walk in a door workshops to introduce students to how to navigate this world of online education.
That makes a ton of sense. JT, I'm sure you've heard also in experiencing, bringing back over 28,000 students, some challenges that they've had that myFootpath works to overcome on behalf of institutions.
Oh, for sure. I mean, when we work with students, I mean, I guess if it were easy, we wouldn't exist, right? But it's we really break the issues down into a couple different categories, right? And probably more that we can go into here. But one of the biggest, right, is just like flexible start dates, right? That's great because we call it course availability. That's the umbrella, right? But do you have the course availability when I need it, right? That's a huge part about the motivation and sort of bringing a student back to kind of derive success.
Our final slide here is going to outline the next of each of our 3 webinars. So we just presented 3 findings: the student financing, planning for enrollment for online adult students, and that concierge level of service. So at each of these, we'll have participants from the study join us to share some of their best practices, where we'll have the opportunity to ask them questions. But moving forward, the white paper is available at the myfootpath.com website, where you can download that. And I am happy to get questions to Dr. Hossler or to JT. If you want to email me directly at Schultheis at myfootpath.com or direct message me through LinkedIn. And we look forward to continuing the engagement. Dr. Hossler, I want to thank you for leading this research project and helping to build this foundation of knowledge upon which I know we're going to continue some additional research studies. And JT, thank you again to myFootpath for finding value and investing in studies with integrity that apply rigor to really look at the answers wherever they lead us. So thanks all for joining us today for this important topic, and we look forward to staying engaged with you.